By the end of this video, I promise that your fears and anxieties about mixing will be eliminated, or at the very least, greatly reduced. This is Mixing Demystified, and in today's video, I will be covering in great detail the basic principles of mixing audio. So let's get right into it. So starting with the basics, what is the purpose of mixing? So mixing is the process of combining all the instruments and sounds in your song so they can be heard as intended. This means that every instrument should be at the proper level, correct location, and have the right timbre. So the first part of mixing is gain staging, and this is the process of setting the levels of all the channels in your song. You're going to be making minor tweaks to the levels continuously throughout the mixing process, but it's good to set the levels first so they're at least close to what they're going to be like in the end. You definitely want to utilize your meters here and see what level all the channels are hitting. At no point should any channel be going above 0 dB.
Oh, hell no!
Try to keep the loudest elements of your track at -6 dB or lower. This ensures that your track isn't clipping once all the channels sum together. And don't worry if your track isn't sounding loud enough. The loudness will be eventually made up for in the mastering stage. Just don't focus on loudness too much yet. To set the gain on the channels, it helps to use a spectrum analyzer to see the relative level of the frequency bands in your track. I like to use the master setting on Voxengo Span, which is a free spectrum analyzer. On master mode, it gives a more bird's eye view of the track. It smoothens out the frequency response, so you're seeing more of like the overall tonal balance of your mix. I would also recommend using a reference track and looking at that in the spectrum analyzer as well. Remember that the reference track is going to be, a mastered track, so it's going to be louder than your unmastered track. So don't look at the absolute value that each frequency band is hitting. Instead, look at the frequency bands in relation to one another. When you look at the spectrum analyzer, observe how much louder the bass is compared to the mids and the highs. Are the highs quieter than the mids or louder? And if so, by how much? This will give you a pretty good starting point to set all the levels in your track. Alright, so quick aside, if you're mixing using studio monitors, then you're not only listening to the sound coming from your speaker, but you're also listening to the sound coming from your speaker and interacting with your room. And the room plays a huge effect on how you hear your mix, especially in the low frequencies.
What? What the fuck?
This is why I also recommend using reference tracks that are well mixed. Because not only are you getting a pretty good idea of the tonal balance of whatever genre of music you're making, but also your studio monitors are probably fooling you to some degree. And it takes some time to also learn your studio monitors and learn your room. So while you're doing that process, it definitely helps to use reference tracks. And just so you don't get fooled by your room, you want to listen to your mix on some headphones and ideally a couple other systems. The classic is the car test, that's my favorite, and also listening to your mix on like AirPods, because those two are unfortunately, especially the AirPods, unfortunately, are what most people are going to be listening to your music on. And then if you're making club music, it definitely helps to play your track out in the club and see what it sounds like on a big PA system. Alright, now back to gain staging. So one thing that I do is I put the limiter on the master channel just temporarily, and I'll start increasing the gain on the limiter. So this tells me which parts of my track are hitting the limiter first. So for example, on this track right here, so what I'll start doing is I'll increase the gain. And then as you can see here, the kick is triggering the limiter before anything else. That's the only thing essentially triggering the limiter, and that indicates to me that the kick is probably too loud. So I'm going to come in here and just decrease the gain on that. So now I'll start increasing limiter gain again. And then now we can see we have a couple other things triggering the limiter as well, which shows that it's a bit more balanced. And then I can go in here into the spectrum analyzer, and then I can look at the levels and see that it's a bit more even. There's still more low end than anything else here, but that's also a little bit because of the genre. But yeah, this is just another way to check your levels. And don't forget to turn off or remove the limiter before you send your mix off to mastering. The next part of the mixing process is panning and placing your sounds spatially in the mix. This is where you decide where you want all the elements of your track to be. I usually do this simultaneously with gain staging because usually when you pan something, you'll want to readjust the levels a little bit. With this, essentially you want to make sure that all the sounds have their own space and can be heard distinctly. If you have a bunch of sounds in the same space, they're bound to overlap and clash with each other, especially in songs with a lot going on. If you have two instruments in the same frequency range, the sound of one is going to mask the sound of the other to some degree, and they're both going to lose some clarity and intelligibility. However, if you pan one instrument left and another one right, they're both going to live in different locations in the mix and have their own space, and will interfere with each other to a lesser degree. I usually don't pan things like 100% left and 100% right because I just find that to be too jarring most of the time, especially with like the lead instruments of the track. But sometimes I might do that with ad-libs or some minor effects. This is also where you need to pay attention to how your mix sounds in mono, and we call this mono compatibility. In Ableton, you can test this by putting a utility on your master channel and selecting mono, or just selecting the left or right channel. There's a few reasons why your track needs to sound good in mono. If you're making dance tracks and music for the club, then obviously your music needs to sound good in a club or at a festival. And the thing is that most of the audience on the dance floor are not perfectly centered between the left and the right speaker. And if you know anything about stereo image, once you start moving even a little bit closer to, either the left or the right, that speaker ends up really dominating what you're hearing. So unfortunately, most people at the club are just getting sound from one channel, either left or right. And that's just the reality of the situation. And even if you're not making club music, you still need to think about the venues that people are going to be listening to your music in. Restaurants, bars, shopping malls, all these places usually have mono systems. This is also why it is typically a good practice to have your main elements in the track center or close to center. Things like the clap, snare, vocal, lead, and definitely your kick and bass. Again, it doesn't hurt to use a reference track here as well, just to see where everything is placed in the mix on that track. Now, when it comes to bass, like I said, you should almost always have that mono because most places just don't have stereo subs, so it's going to get monoed out anyway. Usually I'll mono everything below about 120 hertz, give or take. That being said, there are some situations where you want to leave a little bit of stereo width in the low end, but knowing when to do that really just comes from experience. So if you're just getting into mixing, then I'd recommend you follow these rules of thumb until you get enough experience to know when to break the rules. Sometimes I'll come into Voxengo or Isotope Imager and check the correlation meter. This shows the correlation between your left and right channels. On the correlation meter, a value of +1 means that the left and right channels are perfectly correlated, aka everything's down the center. And a value of -1 means they're completely decorrelated, and you definitely don't want that. You really don't want your mix to go below 0 correlation. Ideally, it stays a little bit closer to 1, but definitely should be on the positive side. The bass is almost always going to be the most powerful element in your track, so if the bass is mono, then usually your correlation will be pretty good. But yeah, having a correlation consistently below 0 is just not good for mono compatibility. Okay, now back to panning. So most often what you'll see in music is that there is more stereo width and separation as you go higher up in frequency. So like we just covered, bass and kick right down the center, then the mids have a little bit more stereo width, and then the high frequencies have even more stereo width. To me, this makes sense because as you go lower and lower in frequency, it actually becomes harder for our brains to localize the sound source. This is also why subs tend to be mono, because even if you had stereo subs, it can still be pretty hard to discern the actual location of the bass, especially if you're in a room that's not acoustically treated, you're not sitting at the right position, and your subs aren't set up correctly. So left to right panning only covers one axis. However, songs can have depth to them as well. Depth? It's a weird word to say, depth. But yeah, songs can have depth to them as well. So things can sound like they're, very up close, or they can sound like they're far away, like at a distance. But how do you do that? Last time I checked, there was no front to back panning knob. And the answer is EQ and reverb. So let's talk about EQ for a sec, and then I'll come back to placing your sounds in the mix front to back. Yo, I'm interrupting myself just for a second here. I'm actually editing the video right now, and I just want to say editing, kind of a pain in the ass. So if you like what you see so far, I would greatly appreciate if you leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and while you're at it, leave a little comment for the YouTube algorithm. Alright, now back to me. So EQ is concerned with the tonal balance of a sound or instrument. Typically, the purpose of EQ in the mixing sense is to get rid of unwanted frequencies and prevent sounds from clashing with one another. The biggest mistake I see with beginner producers is going way too hard on the EQ and abusing it. I will see things like this on a lead vocal or instrument.
Stop it. Get some help.
And I know that like rules are meant to be broken, but an EQ this drastic in most scenarios will just not result in anything sounding good. A crazy EQ like this is usually done in the sound design stage when you want to like mangle sounds and make some real like crazy sounding shit. But when it comes to mixing, you want to be a little bit more delicate with the EQ, especially when it comes to boosting. So the general rule of thumb is that cutting is better than boosting. And I'll say that again because it's actually pretty important. Cutting is generally better than boosting. A lot of times when you're making these large, narrow boosts, you end up creating these weird resonances and then bringing up stuff that you don't really want to hear that can be very harsh. If there is part of a frequency range in an instrument that you want to hear more, rather than boosting, try cutting the frequencies you don't want to hear, either using like a shelf, a low pass filter, or a notch, and then boosting the overall level of that channel. Now, gaining up a certain frequency range isn't always bad, but when you do it, just be cognizant of how narrow the bandwidth of the filter you're using is. So typically, if you're using a filter with a lower Q value, when we're talking about a notch, then you're gonna get a more balanced and controlled sound. Like I said earlier, when you have a very small Q, aka like it's a very narrow notch, then you could potentially bring up weird resonances. So just be wary of that. When it comes to cutting frequencies, however, you can use a more narrow filter. And that's because a lot of times you will run into scenarios where there's like some very weird resonances that are ringing out at like some specific frequencies. And for that, you'll want to use a very narrow bandwidth notch filter just to take out that resonance you don't want to hear. And most of the time there's no reason to have anything below about 80 to 120 hertz in any instrument outside of your kick and bass. So for that, you should use a high pass filter or a low shelf to take away some of those sub frequencies. This is another one of those rule of thumb that like applies to most scenarios, but there are still some cases where you might want to leave some low end in any instruments or sounds outside of your kick and bass. But all that is very track dependent, and hopefully you know what you're doing, otherwise you could potentially hurt the quality of the low end. Okay, so now that I've covered EQ, we can come back to how to place your sounds depth-wise in your mix. Remember that topic? Right. So in order to place something close up or make it sound like it's far away, you first need to understand what makes something sound like it is close up or far away. The most obvious thing is that sounds that are far away are going to be quieter since the sound has to travel a longer distance. So this just means turning down the gain.
Nice.
Another thing is that low frequencies can travel farther than high frequencies. Because of their long wavelengths, they can easily move around objects, whereas high frequencies cannot. Think of lightning that strikes close by versus from a far distance. The thunder from the lightning that's far is just going to be like this low frequency rumble. However, when lightning strikes right next to you, that's when you hear that high frequency crackle. So if you want to make a sound seem like it's coming from a distance, then you can use an EQ to shelve or low pass some of the high frequencies. The more you take off, the farther away it's going to sound. The other factor here is reverb and delay. You don't want the reverb to be too loud if your goal is to make something sound close up. If you drown something in reverb and delay, naturally it's going to sound like it's coming from a distance. For me, it helps to visualize my mix in a 3D space along 3 axes, pretty much like a cube. So you have left to right, and then you have front to back, that's the depth we're just talking about. And then you have high frequency, low frequency. So if all your sounds and instruments have their own place in this 3D space, this cube, then they're not going to be fighting with each other and clashing and overlapping, and your mix is going to sound pretty clean. Now let's touch on reverb just a little bit more. Reverb gives something a sense of space. If a sound has a large reverb, it's going to sound like it's in a large room. And likewise, if it has a small reverb, it's going to sound like it's in a small room. To get a cohesive sounding mix, you don't want like 10 different reverbs on your track. That'll make it seem like all your instruments are in different spaces and environments, and they won't sound together. I usually just use like 2 or 3 reverbs, one small and a large, or maybe a small, medium, large. maybe a fourth reverb for like effect sort of things, but that would be used seldomly. This also helps with the depth of your mix. The shorter reverbs tend to make things sound a little bit more up close than the larger reverbs. It also helps to use headphones when dialing the reverb. Usually the headphones will really tell you whether you're overdoing the reverb, which is a very common beginner mistake. So the last part of this discussion is compression, and compression is a little bit trickier because it takes more time to train the ear to hear compression than it does to hear EQ or level changes. And there are a couple main use cases for compression, so I'll cover 4 here in this video. So number 1 is to compress or tame transients. This makes something less dynamic and keeps the volume at a more consistent level. Vocals are a very common use of this because they tend to be pretty dynamic, and when people are delivering vocals, there's like plosives in the words, and then they might move back and forth between the mic, so all that is going to cause some inconsistency in the level of the track. So you put a compressor on the vocal to make the volume more consistent. For this, you want your compressor to have a relatively quick attack to take care of the transients early, anything like the plosives or whatever is going on in your track. So the second use of this is the opposite of the first one, and this is to emphasize transients, make something more punchy, more snappy, and this is very typical on drums. In this case, you want to set the compressor to have a slower attack so it lets that transient come through and you're not immediately squashing it. For the release, I usually set it to like a medium to fast release time. Again, it's going to be dependent on what you're compressing and the tempo of your track, but typically what I find myself doing for drums is around like 30 to 100 millisecond release time. Sometimes even shorter, but again, really just depends. So the third use case of a compressor is to put it on a bus or a group of tracks. When you group similar tracks together or you send them to the same bus, it can really help to add a compressor to that bus or group to help gel all the sounds together. So when all these different tracks are going through the same processing or compressor, then they're going to sound more cohesive. And again, you're making sure that there's no unwanted level changes or spikes in volume. So the last one, number 4, is sidechain, and I'm sure a lot of you are probably already familiar with this. And so I won't go over in too much detail, there's already a bunch of videos on this topic. But essentially with sidechaining, you're using a compressor to duck the volume of one track every time another track plays. So one of the tracks is going to be the trigger that's going to trigger the compressor. Most common use of sidechain is, of course, kick and bass. So every time the kick plays, the bass ducks momentarily to let the kick come through, and that's going to, allow the kick to punch through the mix and also free up some headroom in your track so that the kick and the bass aren't colliding. But you can use this on anything. A lot of times I'll sidechain a lead to a vocal so that every time the vocal plays, the lead ducks in volume just a little bit to let that vocal punch through. And you can even do, like, if you have 2 leads and you don't want them interfering with each other, then again, you can sidechain one lead to another. I use this a lot whenever I have instruments that are in the same frequency range, and if they're playing a little bit at the same time, I might just sidechain one to the other just to get just one of them out of the way. If you want to compress only certain frequencies and leave the other frequency ranges alone, then you can use a multi-band compressor. This will only compress the frequency range that you set it to. My personal favorite is FabFilter Pro MB. It's like super simple to use, very transparent, and yeah, FabFilter just makes really dope plugins. So to sum it all up, the basic principles of mixing can be boiled down to gain staging, panning, EQ, reverb, and compression. And you don't need these like fancy plugins to get a good mix. If you understand and practice these principles enough, you can get amazing sounding mixes with just stock plugins. Once you fully grasp these concepts, then the fancy, nice plugins can help you squeeze out the last 2 or 3% of sonic potential out of your track. And with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mixing Demystified. If you enjoyed this and found it helpful, leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, and also just leave a comment down below to push this video in the YouTube algorithm. And if you want to contact me, you can always hit me up on Instagram @durosai or email me djdurosai@gmail.com. Ask me any questions, feel free. I also do mixing, mastering, coaching, so if you're interested in any of that, feel free to hit me up. Alright guys, peace, and I hope you have a good one. See ya.
Bye, have a great time.